Does your planning process leave you stuck? Here's what you're missing. I'm going to give you the top 3 reasons why plans fail and how to fix it. If you're like me, if you're like a lot of senior leaders, you spend so much time planning, but a lot of times it's the follow through, and that could be you personally, it could be your team, it could be your corporation, you name it. It's not the planning that's the problem, it's the execution around it, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. A lot of times plans and planning feels really overwhelming, and unexpected challenges inevitably arise. There's a military saying about no plan survives first contact with the enemy, or the great philosopher Mike Tyson, I'll paraphrase here, says no plan survives the first punch in the face, that sort of thing. And so how do we deal with those kinds of challenges, needing to be agile, adaptable, and still move forward without having this incredible sense of overwhelm as leaders? Because we are ultimately responsible for the outcomes, and it's a real challenge. Think about all the effort you've wasted in the past, again, on the personal side, the professional side, and a lot of plans just sit untouched. And we take great pride in having the plan, and maybe it's a binder, maybe it's a knowledge base, or whatever that looks like, and we're really happy with the outcome of it. And yes, there is value in the planning process itself, but ultimately, what's the purpose of having a plan if we don't, 1, stick to it, and 2, we don't ever actually use it in the first place? So what's the cost of not having a system that actually works? First of all, frustration all around. It's your own frustration. It's the frustration of your team. It's the frustration of the corporation, the stress levels, those kinds of things, that emotional impact of not having a process or not having a good plan in place or a system. Your high performers, the golden geese of your team, they get really pissed off because the chaos, some really thrive in it, but ultimately that can get pretty frustrating because they don't even know what the goalposts are. They don't know the left and the right. And so yes, they're going to be high performers, and yes, they're going to move forward, but a big mistake that leaders make is leaving them on their own and then wonder why they leave. There's so much non-coordinated activity when there's a lack of a plan or lack of a planning process or a system. Man, everyone's busy, but they're not being productive, and that's a big issue. Nowadays, with folks working remote, hybrid, in the office, different time zones, all of those things, man, it can get extra chaotic when everyone is left to their own devices. And just so we're clear, most people are well-meaning, well-intentioned, but the lack of planning process, the lack of a plan, the lack of a system is really costing you time, money, effort, not just your own, but those of your team. And that is a major problem. Okay, I get it. But what do we do about it? Well, step number 1 is really establish what your priorities are. In order to chaos principle that I adhere to, that I've come up with, just given my years in crisis leadership, project management, and executive coaching for a long time, is not everything that's important is urgent. So if you look at, say, for example, a wildfire, right? Just to use an extreme example, everything's important. Evacuating people, of course, that's important. Safeguarding infrastructure, absolutely. Make sure responder safety is taken into account. All of those things, 1,000%. But let's look at infrastructure, for example. So infrastructure in a wildfire context can be like a water treatment plant, it can be a school, it can be a hospital, it can be a major electrical line, it can be a railroad, all sorts of different things. And each and every one of those things, to include the daycare, is important. The challenge we run into is separating the important from what the urgent is. And in order for us to do that, we have to establish what our priorities are first and foremost. And those priorities need to be visited time and time again, and our progress against those priorities. So once we've established what our priorities are, because then every decision that we make is viewed through the lens of priorities, we need to adopt a system or a structure that's agile, so it moves really quickly. It's adaptable, so it can move to fit whatever the situation is. It's simple, yet powerful. So something that comes to mind for me is it doesn't require kind of Six Sigma or huge certification training or any of those other things too. It needs to be something that's straightforward enough that it really minimizes our time when we're onboarding. It minimizes the complexity of managing that process, all of those kinds of things. So First, establish those priorities, and then adopt that structure that is agile, adaptable, simple, yet powerful. And it's a system that aligns at all levels. So that strategic piece with the tactical. Man, oh man, if I had a dime for every time executives left a meeting, including myself, saying, man, you know what, that's a really good plan. We are so smart. And then realize a month later that what's going on? The front line, one, it doesn't resonate with them, or two, they didn't even know about the strategy to begin with. So there's a lack of alignment. So the system has to take that into account, the structure. A system that I've moved from the crisis leadership world, whether it be wildfires, floods, so on and so forth, and moved it into my corporate is called P-Post. And it's a structure that really allows us, I've used it for years again on the crisis leadership side, because the question comes, we have 5,000 responders, for example, for a wildfire. How do we get them all moving in the same direction? And without a stratified system or structure, it would be absolute chaos. And so it's a system called P-Post. What is P-Post? I'll just cover it at a high level here. There will be other content and is other content and around that. And if you're interested, comment P-Post down below or DM me P-Post. So the first P is priorities. We spoke about that in the first step. So in the case of, let's say, crisis leadership, it is typically life and safety, it's critical infrastructure, it's incident stabilization, so not making the system worse, those kinds of things. So if we were to apply that in corporation, maybe it's a priority is to gain market share against a particular competitor or in a particular space. That is a priority. Awesome. Okay, good. So we figure out what our priorities are. The next step, the next P, if you will, in the P-Post is what problems do we have against that priority? So in other words, to put it very simply, what threats do we have to that priority? Those are problems or issues. So we would list all of those things. So if we were to look at market share, for example, what are some problems with that? One, we have a competitor that is highly visible in the space. We have lack of a presence in a particular geography, if that's the case, or online, content marketing, any of those kinds of things. So what are the problems? And we would list all of the problems around that. So we have our priorities, then we have our problems, which are our threats to those priorities. Then we get into our objectives. Simply put, those are what are we going to do about those problems? So see how that works? So we have a priority, we have a problem. Now we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. And the objective should meet that SMART criteria. I know this is acronym soup here today, but needs to meet that SMART criteria. But there's a nuance to the SMART criteria that I apply. So there's specific, there's measurable. This one is action orientated. So it needs to be a verb. And then the R is relevant. Okay, so it needs to actually fit the situation. And then T is time sensitive. So that's the SMART criteria: specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, and time-sensitive. So what are we going to do about it? It meets that SMART criteria. So priorities, problems which are a threat to those priorities. The objective is what are we going to do about that? We can have multiple objectives for that problem. And then the S in P-Post is strategy. I understand that there are so many definitions of strategy. I totally get it. For me, simple is powerful. So what is the S, the strategy in P-Post? It's simply how are we going to do that? So we have our problems, we have our objectives, what are we going to do about it? And then our strategies, how are we going to achieve that? And then the T in P-Post is tactics. That's where we're getting into the who at that point. So see how that aligns? And in fact, you should and must connect the dots. So you have a priority down to a tactic, and if you were to draw it out on a whiteboard in a Trello or anything like that, you'd see actually a connection. You can have multiple strategies, multiple tactics, but ultimately it's like a web or a mind map is another way of thinking about it. So that's the system that I teach and have used for over 30 years in both corporations and in crisis leadership. That's a structure that is so powerful, but more on that if you want. An order to chaos principle called 80%. And it's not the 80% rule that you might be think of, what's the amount of effort to get 80%, those kinds of things. For me, I recognize that analysis paralysis is a killer. It kills momentum, kills morale, kills all sorts of things. I'm very much of the opinion that There's very little in this world that we can't fix, that we can't course correct on. And literally making life and death decisions on the regular, I can tell you in a few instances, obviously where life safety is at risk, yes, there are some things that we want to avoid. But apart from that, we can assess and then adjust. And that's the important part. Whatever decision we make in our post or any kind of decision-making model, we need to commit to assess it and then make some adjustments to it. And that is step 3. And that is the assess and the adjust piece. Recognizing that there's a principle that I call source of truth. So recognizing that you have to establish what is or what are your sources of truth. What is that information that you will be drawing upon that is vetted, validated, challenges have been, or assumptions have been challenged, all of those kinds of things. Also recognizing that maybe we don't have the data yet, and that's okay. As long as we commit to continue to gather that information during our assessment and then adjusting phase. Maybe you put them into a dashboard. Maybe it's a spreadsheet. I've managed many a wildfire, many a flood, many a project with a old school spreadsheet. Is it ideal? No, it's not. But you can set it up that traffic light system do red, yellow, and green for sure, provided that you have that criteria in place and you go through and you establish what we call a rhythm, an operational tempo, a cadence. And maybe that cadence is maybe it's twice a day, maybe it's once a week, depending. But what's important about that cadence is that it creates, or it has what we call a sit rep built into it. A sit rep is simply a situational report. It's not a long diatribe, it's simply an update where you're going to all of the key individuals or the key areas, the key departments, and you're just getting a quick status update and you're identifying any issues or challenges. It's not a discussion. It's not a decision-making meeting unless you can make a quick decision on it, but it's essentially to identify issues that are popping up and you can handle them when they're small. So that's the sit rep. So that goes into that step 3 of the assess and the adjust. So we've got prioritize. We've got implement a system like P-Post. We've got now, once you've decided, make sure that you're assessing and that you're adjusting your plan on the regular. So I went through a bunch of those things there. So if you're curious to hear more, just comment P-Post or DM me P-Post, and hopefully you can take some of that and apply it into your own personal and professional life.